Greetings and bienvenue crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
So, this story begins with me helping my grandmother by painting her house, due to the fact that this lady on a ladder would, at best, result in a broken hip, and at worst, a broken neck. I suppose she could have hired some professional painters, but she happened to live in bumfuck nowhere, the Dallas, Oregon, and our family has this annoying habit of staying poor. So hiring laborers would be too costly. Some more context: my whole family on my mother's side are Jehovah's Witnesses, or Jehovos, as I like to call them. I'm guessing this happened sometime after the family crossed the Atlantic. This has led to them becoming very strange, but nothing that would warrant serious intervention. For example, they are firm believers in the paranormal, and that invoking God's name can thwart off threats. All in all, after studying my family history, I decided this was a major improvement from our semi-nomadic, gypsy past, which had a tendency to give me the shivers thinking about the strange things that our ancestors did. Pick semi-related. It's the kind of bumfuckery you'd see in the Dallas. Arrive at my grandmother's house on a small lot of land in the middle of fucking nowhere. A few houses within eyesight, but the place is isolated. The only noise you heard aside from the noise you made was the neighbor's rooster in the morning. As soon as I get in the door, she tries to sell me on this month's issue of The Watchtower, a church-issued magazine. Yeah, okay grandma, so what parts of the house am I painting? She had just moved into this new house, so she gave me a tour. The first thing I noticed was how basic it was. She wasn't at risk of freezing, but there were patches with no insulation. Instead of paint on many of the walls, there was this ancient, cheap wallpaper that was fading. The whole place gave me this run-down and cheap feel. One bit that weirded me out was how strangely the house was planned out, or how little of it was actually planned out. There were seemingly random doorways and chambers, which was a little unnerving considering that many of these rooms served little obvious purpose. The house was a medium size, which was large considering it was only housing my grandmother and her 12-year-old Shiza. The creepiest thing about the place was all the abandoned shit everywhere. Books, clothes, rusty tools, kitchenware, children's toys, etc. Apparently her inner gypsy kicked in and decided all this leftover, worthless trash was acceptable. That or she needed a cheap place, and when the landowner said as is, they really meant as is. It becomes apparent that this trip to paint her house may extend a few days, so I can make her home somewhat respectable and habitable. Decide that I'll get started on the place first thing in the morning, seeing as I had arrived at about 8:30 and it was now nearly 10 p.m. So, we eat dinner in the living room, and I get set up on the couch. About 30 minutes into trying to sleep, I'm ripped from my trance by the sound of footsteps down the hallway. Grandma. No response. I don't know what's going on, but I feel anxious, so I reach down to the floor and pull my pocket knife out of my shoe, as if that would be my lifeline. Something about this place just gives me bad vibes. While I'm fumbling around on the ground for my knife, I can hear some items being shuffled about in the impenetrable blackness down the hallway. I freeze. The fact that I can't see whatever this is causes me to get increasingly nervous, and I try to hold my breath. I know that if it starts coming towards me, I'll be able to see it coming by the bluish-gray moonlight cast across the hallway in a slanted square shape. In the silence that follows, I can hear my grandmother snoring loudly down the hallway. Nothing happens for some time. Whatever it was didn't sound particularly threatening, just unexpected. As I attempt to go back to sleep, I can hear something softly pattering about in the attic, which starts to feel less threatening over time, and I eventually drift off. The next morning, I ask my grandmother if she has a rodent problem, seeing as this house was anything but modern and critters could easily get in. No rats or raccoons, she says. That's interesting. We hear the crackling of her gravel driveway, and somebody in an 80s Chevy square body truck stops outside the house. It's the neighbor. He starts explaining how he heard some weird stuff last night, and he wanted to make sure that I was aware of the property lines. Apparently, I upset the balance of this place by causing more than 30 mammals to be occupying the same 1,000 square yards, and now shit's getting funky. Weird, I haven't left the building since I got here. We'll keep an eye out. Apparently the last person to live here was another old lady that died about 10 years ago. At this point, I'm not too worried about anything, so I got about my plan to start painting. This goes on without incident for about 6 hours until I start painting one of the purposeless rooms. The stepladder is facing a wall, and I'm on the top rung painting the corner in between the wall and the ceiling. I'm thinking about some sophomore slut and painting away when I hear something above me that makes my heart sink. It's the kind of sound that is made when somebody makes a single step or puts pressure on one foot on a creaky floorboard, a kind of slow, moaning creaking noise. I have a mini panic attack, ditch the brush and jump off the ladder with my hands up. Fucking rats. I get a little frustrated that I just shaved 3 months off of my life, after exercising my heart like that over a damned animal. I'm calming down and inspecting the room for anomalies, until I see that there is a trapdoor leading to the attic from this room. Okay. Grandma, could you come in here? Proceed to ask her about the attic and if she has started to store things in here yet, as my cousins moved her in here. Really, I'm just a gigantic pussy and wanted her to be there while I checked it out. What a surprise, more leftover shit up here. Also, other leftover shit in the form of animal feces, confirming my suspicions. She's bringing in boxes for me to lug up here, when I find something very strange. A ring of dead rose petals, some symbols written on the plywood, surrounding some dust ash and a plain wooden figurine. For some reason, this featureless literal stick figure gave me a strong feeling of dread. What the fuck? I started to get this paranoid feeling that I didn't belong there, and that I needed to get the fuck out of there. Immediately start telling my grandmother what I found, standing 12 feet above her and speaking through the square hole in the ceiling. Her eyes double in size and she turns white. She starts shouting at me to grab the doll with her handkerchief and bring it downstairs immediately. I got to grab the doll, but the feeling of dread intensifies tenfold. I experience the surreal feeling of torment, in which time slows and I fearfully gaze at the doll before grabbing it. This whole event lasted 5 seconds, but it felt like a minute. I bring the figurine down and head towards the living room. The front door is open, and my grandma has clearly entered psycho mode. In the middle of the driveway she's already made a small pile of firewood and lit it with some matches and some kerosene. She shrieks at me to hurry up and throw it in the blaze. We sat there watching it burn and I felt a huge catharsis, like all my worries were alleviated and the threat was gone. As we watched it burn, I looked at the details of the figure. It had no facial features, and the thing was clearly handmade. You could see the chisel marks. About 5 minutes into just standing there watching this thing burn, we hear a loud bang. The front door had slammed shut and bounced open again, about 30 degrees ajar and creeping further. She invites me to come inside and pray with her. I don't fight her on this one. We come in and pray, and she does some sloppy but very serious blessings around the house. Decide to call it an early day, and we play cards, talk, eat dinner, and go to bed. Seriously jolted by what I saw up there, but I'm able to keep cool. The night was the same as last night in the sense that right when I was about to get some sleep I awake to some quiet noises in the darkness. This time my heart is about to jump out of my chest, as I realize this is most likely not a fucking raccoon. I'm staring down the hallway again, looking past my feet, waiting for something to step out into the moonlight and reveal itself. I can fucking feel it creeping back there. As I start to breathe normally again, I can see something in the light. The most horrifying thing I have ever seen begins a kind of hurried walk towards me. The creature is 5 feet tall and humanoid, with long black hair, I cannot distinguish, and features. Its skin is as black as the void, aside from white glowing eyes. Before I can move it reaches me, staring me dead in the eyes inches from my face. I scream in terror. I honestly thought I might have just died of fright because I saw nothing. I realize that I was dreaming and that the hallway is completely black. It was a cloudy night. A hallway light is flicked on and my grandmother comes in to check on me. I'm speechless, but I can sense that she knows what happened. I decide to sleep on the floor in my grandmother's room that night like a child, but honestly, I have never been more frightened by something I can't see in my entire life. The next few days nothing happened, although I never entered the attic again. My grandmother apparently had some elders come to her home and sanctify it, and she didn't mention anything else happening. She moved out of there about 6 months later, and I haven't been there since. The entity in question is something I have read about on X about only twice. They all describe it the same way: short, black humanoid that moves quickly. I wish I knew what the fuck it was.
Location: near Cao Bang, North Vietnam, at the time. Date: August 12 to 13, 1968. A group of Soviet engineers were working in this region hoping to build a hydroelectric power plant when they heard a rumbling of engines overhead. They all ran out of their tents and were surprised to see a black, diamond-shaped object hovering in the sky, emitting a greenish-blue light. Moments later, the diamond-shaped object was struck by a fiery object that seemed to come from out of the earth. There was a bright flash, followed by a powerful shock wave that knocked the Russians down, tore their tents apart, and swept away their equipment. Somehow, no one was seriously hurt, but the explosion deeply troubled everyone. For several hours, all the radio and communication equipment was down, and they had to wait until morning to report the incident to their superiors. They promised to prepare a full report on the incident. 2 days later, the scientists found a black sphere-shaped object, about 3 meters in diameter, a short distance from camp. The surface of the sphere was completely black and reflected no light. Even stranger, the sphere did not cast a shadow. The rays of the sun seemed to go around and right through the object, falling on the high grass all around it. The scientists also noticed that the sphere was cool and slippery, as if doused with soapy water. One of the men attempted to scratch the surface of the sphere with a sharp knife to no avail. They notified their superiors about their strange finding, and soon afterwards, the group received instructions to set up a protective perimeter around the object and to guard it until a special group arrived. They were strictly warned not to get within 20 meters of the sphere, so the entire group, 5 men total, camped exactly 20 meters away from the sphere. They had no idea what the sphere could be and guessed it was some kind of new weaponry. After building a small bonfire, the men sat down to rest. One of the specialists, Boris Ivanov, wrote in his diary that the men rested uneasy, staring at the object with their carbines ready, just in case. As they waited for the Special Forces group to eventually show up and take control of the situation. Soon one of the men, Vyacheslav, stood up and walked into the brushwood, which was in the direction of the sphere. The rest barely noticed, thinking he was just walking off to relieve himself. When he didn't return, the men began to nervously call out his name, but there was no response. They searched the area with flashlights, but could not find Vyacheslav. Concerned and afraid, the rest of the men eventually gave up and returned to the bonfire. An hour later, another man named Peter silently rose and also walked into the brushwood in exactly the same direction. that Vyacheslav had taken. He seemed to move uncomfortably, rocking back and forth as if very drowsy. A kind of anxiety suddenly enveloped the rest of the men, and they remained sitting by the bonfire, unable or unwilling to intervene. Peter never returned. This time the remaining men did not search for Peter, but simply sat and waited. A feeling of doom filled the men. 2 hours later, Vladimir walked off in the direction of the sphere. It was obvious that he had no control. It was as if something were forcing him away from the bonfire. He also never came back. Now only 2 men remained, Boris and Sergei. Both were frozen with fear, refusing to move in the slightest from their positions. Suddenly, Sergei's face became distorted. He stood up like a marionette and meandered away into the dark in the direction of the strange sphere. Moments later, Boris began to feel his body losing its terrified stiffness and beginning to move. Terrified, he grabbed his carbine and shot himself on the leg so that he wouldn't walk away to an uncertain fate. As a result of the pain, he passed out. This action possibly saved Boris. He woke up in the morning when the specialists arrived. They found him half-conscious by the now extinguished fire. He had lost a lot of blood but was still alive. However, the sphere had disappeared along with his comrades. He was soon thereafter evacuated from the area. But the event left him convinced that the sphere had been responsible for the disappearance of his friends.
Myuu. The Paiute Indians have told stories about a vast underground city hidden beneath Death Valley for centuries. They call this place the Kingdom of Shinoav, meaning ghost land, and they consider it to be the former home of a race of giants as well as a portal to the underworld. According to legend, it was originally discovered by a widowed chief who, in his grief, decided to live out his days in the desert. However, he stumbled upon a cave system which led him to Shinoav in the land of the dead. The story goes that he was reunited with the spirits of his dead wife and they were both allowed to return to the land of the living, but they were warned against looking back as they went. However, the chief couldn't help himself and glanced back in spite of himself, causing both the city and his wife to vanish before his eyes. Notice the striking similarity to the story of Orpheus here. Then, in 1947, a retired physician-turned-explorer named Dr. F. Bruce Russell, moved out west for his health. He and a colleague, Dr. Daniel S. Bovee, decided to check out mining opportunities while they were there. One day, while sinking a shaft for a mining claim, the soil gave way and Russell fell down into a cave where he was surprised to discover a catacomb of tunnels leading off in different directions. Russell and Bovee explored the caverns, eventually following the tunnel that led them to the mummified remains of 3 gigantic men who were 8 to 9 feet tall. Additionally, the room that these remains were in held a number of artifacts that resembled Egyptian and American Indian designs. Russell later related the event to one Howard D. Hill, proclaiming his belief that he and Bovee had only scratched the surface of their discovery. They had found at least 32 tunnels, Russell said, and he estimated that they ran across 180 square miles, below Death Valley and parts of southern Nevada. However, no one in the professional world of archaeology was interested enough in the story to personally check it out. Dr. Russell took it upon himself to, with a group of investors, create a corporation to handle the release, and hopefully profit, from the remarkable find. But in the constantly shifting sands of the desert, Russell was unable to find the site the next time that he tried to show his friends. People began to suspect that Russell had concocted the whole story. And this might have been the end of the tale, except for one more strange detail. Russell mysteriously disappeared while out in the desert. Months went by with no sign of him, until finally his car was found in a remote area of Death Valley, abandoned, and with a burst radiator. Russell's suitcase was still in the car.
Oh, man. This story is really fucking weird. The guy who shared this story returned a few times to share updates. These updates will be dated when I post them. I'm an early riser. I get up around 4 a.m. most days, and I like to sit outside before the sun rises to have a smoke. On this particular morning, I was outside with a cup of tea just before dawn. I was thumbing a bowl of tobacco in my pipe when I heard a shuffling toward the pine trees at the edge of my property. The back of my house faces the edge of a thick line of short pine trees, and I see critters run in and out of it all the time, so I assumed the noise was an armadillo or something. But when I looked up I saw what looked like a large woman with sagging breasts, except her head was kind of like an odd lump on her shoulders, very small and without hair or any normal features. I immediately set my things down on the patio table and called out to her. There was just enough light from the floodlights on my house to see her large bare bottom as she turned and ran away. I could very easily hear the thumping sounds of feet in the pines. I called the police right then and there, and told them what I'd seen. 3 county deputies responded within 20 minutes, and they scoured my entire property, and searched around the edge of the pine trees. For over an hour, I recalled what I'd seen, giving them every detail I could remember. None of us could come up with any explanation. The lot of pine trees is 20+ acres, and connects to a stretch of grassland, where the only humans would be whoever is on the interstate. I urged them to search the pines, convinced there was a naked woman running around in there. Methamphetamine and other harsh drugs are not unknown where I live, and in my years living in this region have seen my share of crazed addicts. The deputies told me they couldn't search just then, and that they would need help. They filed a report, and told me to go inside and lock my doors. I did so. I also retrieved my pistol from the bedroom and stuck it in my waistband. Around 1 p.m. a new lot of deputies came knocking, and I walked them over to exactly where I'd seen this person. 2 of them hung back with me while the others went into the pines looking around. They spent about a half hour in there before they came back with no evidence or explanation. They were all very helpful but didn't sound very concerned, and eventually left after scanning around my backyard a bit too. Every morning since then when I went out to have my morning smoke my eyes were fixed on the pines, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary until I was up late one night. I'd been entertaining guests earlier and had made us a pot of strong coffee, so I couldn't sleep. They left around midnight, and an hour later, after cleaning up, I stepped out back with a glass of wine and my pipe. I turned the back lights on and immediately saw the fat woman again. This time I could see her much better. When the dim light hit her body, she moved like a dog would if it had suffered an injury. I could see her face better this time, and it definitely looked like she was missing her nose. She lopped into the pines again, but this time I ran towards her as fast as my legs could carry me. I have very little cartilage left in my knees, so it wasn't very fast. I heard her shuffling away into the pines just as I reached the tree line, then I called the police. They said they were on their way, so I went back inside, turned on all the outside lights, and grabbed a flashlight and my pistol. This time they went deep in the pines. I could see their flashlights flickering around, and they finally came back and said they couldn't find anything. They advised me again to lock my doors and keep my gun close at hand. By the time the police left it was almost 3 a.m., and when I went inside my cat Augustus was growling at the back window. I decided to try to nap in my big chair hoping my cat would join me, but we were both too nervous. Just before dawn I'd almost fallen asleep when Augustus began growling loudly again and slapping at the small window. I turned on the lamp and got a full glimpse of the half-face of the large woman. I knew it was her immediately. Her face had holes where a nose should be and swollen lips. Her eyes were dark brown all over and not like normal eyes. I got up and yelled, pointing my pistol at her, and she turned and ran. I saw her scramble away through the window, then went to the patio door and turned the lights on so I could see better. Her breasts were swinging and the mass of her body as she ran toward the pines. I opened the door and fired 2 shots toward the top of the pines. I had no desire to harm her, but I wanted to put the fear in her that I was armed and done playing around. I'm not a young man and I live alone, but with a faithful cat and several guns. I again called the police, only this time I went to their office to speak to a detective. She was more than helpful and said they would patrol the area regularly and that if someone was running around out there, they would catch her. This was in January, and I didn't have any more problems except for my guard cat and I not being able to sleep very well at night. I haven't seen her since then, but I know in my heart now she isn't really a woman but something else. It's been 3 weeks since I've last heard from the police about it, but I lately have the feeling that she is still out there. Augustus and I are ready if she comes back, though he is much braver than I am. I'm thinking about moving away. March 17, 2020 tonight one of my neighbors came to my house, the closest of the two from me. I don't want to say any names because he is a genuine guy and I like him a lot, but I have known him for a few years now, and I trust him. I am going to talk to him more later today. My neighbor went on asking me if I had heard screaming and loud thud sounds coming from the pine sprawl. I said I hadn't and told him I had been listening to music on my laptop most of the evening, so I wouldn't have heard anything anyway. But I did mention that my cat had been darting around and it might have been him hearing those sounds. Both of my neighbors know about what happened to me as I went directly to their doors to tell them about it. I wanted them to be aware, and now my neighbor is hearing what he described as definitely human screams and thuds that sounded like trees falling, but without the snapping sounds of branches. I told him to load a gun, and keep an ear out for anything else. Me and Augustus have gotten comfortable now in the living room, and we don't take chances anymore. I am going to talk to my neighbor more, including my farthest neighbor later today. March 17, 2020. Here is what happened today. I was up very late listening to music. Another tool I use for settling my nerves. I don't sleep in my bedroom anymore and have started sleeping on my couch or in my big chair. So when Wayne knocked on my door around 1 midnight asking if I had heard the screaming or the big thud sounds, I told him I hadn't because I had been listening to music and had not looked at my phone when he said he tried to call me a bunch but saw my lights on, so he came over. I told him to load a gun and sleep lightly. I did the same because it was strange to see Wayne so late. Wayne owns a building materials business, so he's an early riser like me. I slept for 6 hours and got up to make some breakfast and feed Augustus. Wayne called me not long after saying that the police had been to our far neighbor's house and that they were all in the field and in the pines. Wayne had not slept and had breakfast made, so he invited me to eat. I crossed the giant grass lot that separates our property and I could see police in the field working around. Over breakfast Wayne called our neighbor again and asked if we could stop by, and he said he wanted to talk to us. Our farthest neighbor is a younger man in his 30s, and he's a good no-nonsense fellow made of hard stuff, but he looked really tired and shaken when Wayne and I got there. He and his girlfriend were dozing off when they were startled by shrill screaming and thrashing at their back door. He said it was like a giant fish flopping on the door and horrible screaming. Their door was something awful. There was major damage to it and deep gashes in mud. They said the thrashing at the back stopped and it was quiet for a minute. As he was getting dressed to go investigate, something slammed itself against the bedroom window and screamed against the glass. His poor girlfriend described it as a throat scream that could have come from a man or a woman. They were both very shaken but were putting on brave faces. He said he grabbed his shotgun and ran outside immediately. He said he heard the screaming getting farther away along the edge of the pines toward Wayne's property. He didn't see anything. The deputies were still walking around outside, and a few of them I recognized. Sure enough, the detective I spoke to kept her word and they had been patrolling the area closely all this time, so they arrived fairly quickly, my neighbor said. The loud thuds that Wayne heard could not be explained, but we have made plans to hike deep through the pines and explore. We all and the deputies had a long talk on my far neighbor's property. In the end, they believed it to be animals or possible malicious mischief. I think from the tone of one of them they suspected Wayne or myself of playing a prank on them in the night, but they didn't directly accuse us. They left us with the advice that if we find someone sneaking around our property at night acting aggressive and strange, to do what we feel is necessary for our safety. We have agreed to keep in close contact with each other from now on and to immediately send texts whenever something happens so we can all assist. I take naps in the day now to stay up a bit later at night.
Here's a short one about something that people seem to experience on a particular street in England, Bolt Street. Perhaps one of the most well-known reports of a time-slip incident on Bolt Street comes to us from the year 1996, when a man named Frank was out shopping in the area with his wife, Carol. As they headed towards one of the shops, Frank ran into an acquaintance and stopped to talk as Carol went ahead to a bookstore called Waterstones. Frank finished up his chat with his friend and went off to join his wife, and that was when he had a sudden and odd feeling that he did not recognize where he was. He went to where he was sure Waterstones was, but he could not locate it, and the street in general looked different than it had just a few minutes earlier. It was a very disorienting feeling, and Frank began wandering around to see if he could get his bearings straight. Suddenly, a van drove by, beeping for him to get out of the way. Frank noticed that it was a very old-fashioned type of delivery van with the name Caplanes emblazoned on the side. Then he noticed that all of the other vehicles were of a vintage design, 1950s or so. For the first time, he noticed that the pedestrians around him were dressed in old-fashioned clothing as well. He managed to find the building that he was certain must be Waterstones, but over the entrance was written the name Cripps, and in the windows were not books, but women's dresses and shoes of a similarly vintage design as the cars and the clothing of the pedestrians. It was then that he noticed a young woman in more modern clothing standing at the entrance of the store looking just as confused as he was, and they both entered the store with quizzical looks on their faces. When they crossed the threshold, Frank then saw that they were in Waterstone's bookstore and everyone inside was wearing modern clothing. The young woman who had entered with him looked around in shock and expressed confusion that it wasn't the clothing store she thought it would be. It would not be until later that Frank would figure out that Cripps had been a popular, historical traditional dressmaking shop that had opened in 1848 and closed down in the 1970s, and that the name on the van, Caplanes, was also a delivery business that had closed down long ago.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.